The autumn rain fell like tears against the diamond-paned windows of Ravenshollow Manor, each droplet catching the amber glow of candlelight before surrendering to gravity's pull. In the shadows of the grand estate's most forbidden wing, a transaction was taking place that would shatter two lives and remake them into something neither could have imagined. Inside the dimly lit study, banknotes changed hands with the crisp finality of a death sentence. The Duke of Ravenshollow, Adrian Blackthorne, sat behind his mahogany desk like a judge pronouncing a verdict. His dark eyes, cold as winter seas, studied the trembling woman before him with calculating indifference. She was not what he had expected. Dr. Elara Whitmore stood with her chin raised despite the circumstances, her physician's hands steady even as her world crumbled. The creditors had left her no choice: her father's gambling debts, her brother's medical studies, her patients who depended on her skill. All of it hung in the balance of this devil's bargain. "The terms are simple," the Duke said, his voice a velvet blade. "1 year, you will reside in the East Wing, available at my convenience. In return, your debts are cleared, your brother's education secured." His lips curved in what might charitably be called a smile. "Do we have an understanding, Miss Whitmore?" Elara's fingers tightened around her medical bag, the one possession she refused to abandon. "Perfectly clear, Your Grace." Neither of them realized that fate had already woven their threads together, that on a rain-soaked battlefield 3 years prior, gentle hands had pulled a dying soldier from the jaws of death. Neither remembered the whispered promise made in delirium, the face glimpsed through fever dreams. The Duke believed he was purchasing a convenient arrangement. The physician thought she was sacrificing herself for family honor. Both were about to discover that destiny rarely announces itself with fanfare. Sometimes it arrives wearing the mask of necessity, speaking in the language of survival, and demanding payment in the currency of the heart. Welcome to a tale where past and present collide, where the healer becomes the one in need of healing, and where love blooms in the most impossible of circumstances. This is the story of a duke who thought he was buying compliance, and the woman whose very presence would teach him the difference between owning and belonging. Before we begin, tell us in the comments what draws you most to historical romance. The forbidden passion, the secrets of the past, or the promise of redemption. The carriage wheels sang a mournful tune against the cobblestones as Dr. Elara Whitmore made her final journey as a free woman. Through the rain-streaked window she watched the familiar streets of London fade into countryside, each mile taking her further from the life she had built with such careful determination. Her reflection in the glass showed a woman of 28, with auburn hair pinned severely back and green eyes that had seen too much suffering to retain their innocence. The severe grey travelling dress she wore was her finest, chosen to present dignity in the face of degradation. Her medical bag sat beside her, leather worn smooth by countless house calls, its contents the tools of a trade she might never practice again. The irony was not lost on her. Dr. Elara Whitmore, one of London's few licensed female physicians, was about to become the Duke of Ravenshallow's kept woman. The same hands that had delivered babies and set bones, that had diagnosed consumption and treated knife wounds, would now serve an entirely different purpose. She closed her eyes and remembered the battlefield. It had been chaos, cannon fire, and screaming men, blood soaking the muddy ground. She had volunteered with the Medical Corps, one of only 3 women brave enough to venture so close to hell. Among the wounded, a young officer lay dying, his uniform marking him as nobility despite the dirt and gore. "Please," he had whispered, his hand gripping hers with desperate strength. "If I die, tell them I tried to be worthy of the name." She had worked through the night to save him, removing shrapnel from his chest, stitching wounds that would have killed a lesser man. In his delirium, he had spoken of duty and honor, of a cold father, and a colder inheritance. She had sung to him, held his hand through the fever dreams, and when dawn broke, he was alive. He had never seen her face clearly, and she had never learned his name. Another anonymous act of healing in a war full of them. Now, 3 years later, as the imposing silhouette of Ravenshollow Manor rose from the mist like something from a Gothic novel, Alara wondered if she would ever heal anyone again. The Duke had made his intentions clear. She was to be available to him. Nothing more. Her medical practice, her calling, her very identity would be buried beneath the role he had purchased. The carriage drew to a halt beneath a stone archway carved with gargoyles. A footman in navy livery opened the door, his face carefully neutral as he helped her down. No judgment, no curiosity, just the practiced indifference of a servant who had seen many women arrive at Ravenshollow under similar circumstances. The great doors opened to reveal a butler of advanced years, his silver hair impeccably groomed, his posture ramrod straight despite what must have been 7 decades of life. "Miss Whitmore," he said with a slight bow, "I am Pemberton. His Grace is expecting you." She followed him through corridors lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors, their painted eyes seeming to track her progress with disapproval. The house was magnificent and cold, all marble floors and gilded surfaces that reflected her image back at her like accusations. They stopped before doors of dark oak, carved with the Blackthorn family crest, a raven in flight, wings spread wide, talons extended. Pemberton knocked once, waited for the commanded entry, then opened the doors to announce her, "Miss Whitmore, Your Grace." The study was a testament to masculine power. Leather-bound books reaching to coffered ceilings, a fire crackling in a hearth large enough to roast a pig, furniture of dark wood and darker intent. Behind the massive desk sat Adrian Blackthorn, Duke of Ravenshollow, and Alara felt her breath catch in her throat. She had expected a libertine, soft with dissipation. Instead, she found herself facing a man who looked as if he had been carved from granite and polished by conflict. His dark hair showed threads of premature silver at the temples, and his face bore the kind of stern beauty that spoke of ancient bloodlines and harder choices. But it was his eyes that stopped her, grey as storm clouds, and haunted by shadows she recognized from her own mirror. He rose as she entered, a courtesy that surprised her. At full height he towered over her, broad-shouldered and lean, moving with the controlled grace of a man accustomed to command. "Miss Whitmore." His voice was different from their first meeting, less cutting, more considering. "I trust your journey was comfortable, adequate." "Your Grace." She kept her voice level, professional. If she was to be his mistress, she would at least maintain her dignity. He studied her for a long moment, and she found herself being assessed like a horse at market. Something flickered in his expression, confusion perhaps, or disappointment. "You are not what I expected," he said finally. "Nor you, Your Grace." His eyebrows rose slightly at her boldness. "Indeed? And what did you expect?" A man more comfortable with his appetites. The ghost of a smile touched his lips. "I am a man of many appetites, Miss Whitmore. Not all of them require a bed." The words sent an unwelcome shiver down her spine. She straightened her shoulders. "Perhaps you could explain my duties more precisely." The arrangement was somewhat vague. He moved around the desk, coming to stand before her, close enough that she could smell his cologne, sandalwood and something darker, more complex. Close enough to see the scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw, a white line that spoke of violence survived. Her fingers itched to examine it. Old habits died hard. "Your primary duty," he said quietly, "is to be available when I have need of you. Your secondary duty is to remain discreet about the nature of our arrangement." Your tertiary duty is to cause me no embarrassment or inconvenience, and in return, your debts are cleared. Your brother's medical education is secured. You are housed, fed, and clothed as befits your station." He paused. "Provided you please me." The threat was velvet-wrapped steel. She nodded once, curtly. "I understand. Do you?" He reached out and touched her chin, tilting her face up to meet his gaze. "I wonder." His thumb brushed across her lower lip, and she felt her heart stutter. Not with desire, she assured herself of that, but with something more complicated. Recognition without memory, familiarity without cause. "Pemberton will show you to your rooms," he said, stepping back. "You may take this evening to settle in. I will send for you tomorrow." She curtsied, hating herself for the gesture of submission. "Your Grace." As she turned to leave, his voice stopped her at the threshold. "Miss Whitmore?" "Yes, Your Grace." "Welcome to Raven's Hollow." The words followed her down the corridor like an epitaph. The east wing of Raven's Hollow Manor felt like a beautiful prison. Lara's apartments were sumptuous beyond anything she had ever experienced. Silk wallpaper in shades of cream and gold, furniture of rosewood and mahogany that gleamed in the firelight, windows that looked out over gardens designed by Capability Brown himself. The bedroom boasted a four-poster bed that could have accommodated a small family, draped in velvet hangings the color of midnight. It was everything a mistress could desire, and it made her skin crawl. She set her medical bag on the writing desk, her only personal possession in this gilded cage. Inside were the tools of her trade, surgical instruments, vials of medicines, bandages and sutures. Each item represented years of study, sacrifice and determination. She had fought for the right to practice medicine, endured mockery and worse to earn her license, and now she was ornamental. A soft knock interrupted her brooding. She opened the door to find a young woman with kind eyes and work-roughened hands, dressed in the neat grey uniform of an upper housemaid. "Begging your pardon, miss," the girl said with a curtsy. "I'm Sarah, assigned to see to your needs. His Grace instructed me to inform you that dinner will be served in your sitting room at 8, and to ask if you require anything for your comfort." Ilara managed to smile. "Thank you, Sarah. I believe I have everything I need." The girl hesitated, then leaned closer. "Miss, if I may, the East Wing hasn't had a resident in some time. The staff are pleased to have someone gentle occupying these rooms again." She paused. "The last lady was difficult." "The last lady?" Sarah's eyes widened, as if she had said too much. That is, it's quite all right," Ilara said gently. "I'm sure the Duke has had many arrangements." After Sarah left, Ilara found herself wondering about her predecessor. Had she also been purchased to warm the Duke's bed? What had happened to her? The questions nagged at her as she unpacked her meager belongings, hanging her few dresses in a wardrobe that could have held the gowns of a dozen women. Dinner arrived precisely at 8, a feast fit for nobility, roasted pheasant with herb stuffing, delicate vegetables in cream sauce, wine that probably cost more than most people earned in a month. She ate mechanically, tasting nothing, her mind circling like a caged bird. After the dishes were cleared, she tried to read, but concentration proved elusive. Every sound in the house seemed amplified: footsteps in the corridor, doors closing, the distant murmur of servants going about their duties. Was the Duke in residence? Was he even now deciding when to summon her? The thought made her stomach clench. She prepared for bed with clinical efficiency, braiding her hair, donning a nightgown of simple white cotton, the most modest garment she owned. If tonight was to be the night, she would face it with whatever dignity she could maintain. But the summons never came. She lay wakeful until dawn, starting at every sound, her body tense with anticipation and dread. Only when the first rays of sunlight crept through the heavy curtains did she finally succumb to exhausted sleep. She woke to find Sarah setting a breakfast tray on the small table by the window. "Good morning, miss," the girl said cheerfully. "His Grace has ridden out for the day. He instructed me to tell you that you are free to explore the house and grounds, with the exception of the West Wing and the Tower Room." Lara sat up, pulling her wrapper around her shoulders. "The West Wing, His Grace's private apartments, miss, and the Tower Room." Sarah lowered her voice. "That's where the Duke spent his time after returning from the war. He permits no one entry." After Sarah left, Ilara dressed in her plainest gown and set out to explore her prison. The house was even more magnificent by daylight, paintings by masters whose names she recognized from textbooks, sculptures that belonged in museums, rooms that spoke of centuries of wealth and privilege. She wandered through galleries lined with portraits, studying the faces of Blackthorn ancestors. They shared the Duke's strong features, his grey eyes, his air of controlled power, but it was one portrait that stopped her cold. The painting showed a younger version of Adrian Blackthorn, perhaps 25 or 26 years old. He wore the uniform of a cavalry officer, his face unmarked by the scar she had noticed, his eyes bright with youth and purpose. The brass plate beneath read, "Captain Lord Adrian Blackthorn, 7th Light Dragoons." Her breath caught. The 7th Light Dragoons. She remembered that regiment. They had been at Balaclava, had suffered heavy casualties in that doomed charge. The wounded officer she had treated, the one whose life she had saved. Magnificent, isn't he? Ilara spun around to find Pemberton approaching, his footsteps silent on the thick carpet. "The Duke?" she managed, as he was before the war changed him. The old butler's eyes were sad as he studied the portrait. He left as Captain Blackthorn, full of honor and idealism. He returned as the Duke of Ravenshollow, his father having died in his absence. Pemberton's voice dropped. "The war took more from him than his innocence, I fear." The scare, among other things. Pemberton turned to study her with eyes that seemed to see too much. "You have the look of someone who has seen battle, Miss Whitmore. Perhaps you understand what it costs a man." She nodded slowly. "I do." "Then perhaps you will have patience with His Grace. He is not as other men. The war left wounds that have never properly healed." Before she could respond, the sound of hoofbeats echoed from the courtyard. Pemberton straightened. "His Grace returns early. Perhaps you should retire to your rooms." But as Ilara made her way back to the East Wing, she found herself thinking not of the Duke who had purchased her, but of the young officer whose life she had saved on a battlefield far from home. The officer who had gripped her hand and begged not to die without honor. The officer who she was beginning to suspect was now her captor. The summons came at sunset. Ilara had spent the day in restless anticipation, unable to read, unable to rest, her mind churning with memories and growing certainty. When Sarah arrived with the message that His Grace required her presence in the study, her hands were trembling as she prepared herself for what was to come. She chose her appearance carefully, a dress of deep blue silk that she had worn to medical conferences, her hair arranged in a simple chignon, no jewelry save her father's watch, on a chain around her neck. If she was to face her fate, she would do so as herself, not as the Duke's ideal of a mistress. Pemberton was waiting to escort her through the maze of corridors. His usually impassive face showed a hint of concern as he glanced at her pale complexion. "Courage, Miss Whitmore," he murmured as they reached the study doors. "His Grace is complex. Do not judge him too quickly." The study looked different in the evening light. Candles flickered in silver sconces, casting dancing shadows on the leather-bound spines of countless books. A fire crackled in the hearth, and the smell of brandy hung in the air like incense. The Duke stood with his back to her, staring into the flames. He had changed from his riding clothes into evening dress, black coat and trousers, white shirt and cravat, all perfectly tailored to his lean frame. His dark hair still showed the impression of his hat, and she caught the scent of horses and wind that clung to him despite his obvious ablutions. "You sent for me, Your Grace." He turned slowly, and she saw that he held a brandy snifter in his left hand. His eyes were slightly unfocused, his usually perfect posture relaxed by alcohol. Drunk, she realized, or well on his way to it. "Miss Whitmore." He gestured to a chair near the fire. "Please, sit." She perched on the edge of the leather wingback, her hands folded in her lap, every muscle tense with anticipation. He studied her over the rim of his glass, and she found herself cataloguing the details of his face, the strong jaw, the aquiline nose, the scar that ran from temple to cheek like a silver river. "Tell me about yourself," he said suddenly. The request caught her off guard. "Your Grace, you intrigue me, Miss Whitmore." A woman of obvious education and breeding, yet one who finds herself in such circumstances. "How does the daughter of a gentleman become?" He waved his hand vaguely. "Available for purchase." Heat rose in her cheeks. "My father left debts. My brother requires funds for his medical studies. I had few options. Medicine?" His eyes sharpened despite the brandy. "Your brother studies medicine?" "At Edinburgh. He hopes to specialize in surgery." "And you? Did you ever consider such studies?" The question was casual, but something in his tone made her wary. Women are not typically encouraged in such pursuits. "That was not what I asked." She met his gaze directly. "I considered many things, Your Grace. Circumstances dictated other choices." He set down his glass and moved to lean against the mantelpiece, studying her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. The firelight played across his features, and she found herself thinking again of that young officer delirious with fever and pain. "You have skillful hands," he observed. Her heart skipped. "Your Grace, when you entered yesterday, I noticed your hands. Long fingers, steady, precise. They speak of careful work." He paused. "What work, Miss Whitmore?" The trap was closing around her, and she could see no way to avoid it. I have some experience in healing arts." "Some experience?" He straightened, moving toward her with predatory grace. "Come now, we agreed on honesty. What experience?" She lifted her chin. "I am a licensed physician." The words hung in the air between them like a challenge. His eyes widened, genuine surprise flickering across his features. "A physician," he said it as if tasting an unfamiliar word. "Licensed by whom?" "The Royal College. I completed my studies at London University, served my residency at Guy's Hospital." Pride crept into her voice, despite the circumstances. "I have been practicing for 5 years. Impossible." "I assure you, it is not." She reached into her reticule and withdrew her medical license, the parchment that had cost her years of struggle to obtain. "See for yourself." He took the document with hands that were no longer quite steady, holding it closer to the firelight to read. She watched his face as the reality sank in. He had not purchased a mistress, but a physician, a woman who had achieved something that few men managed, who had fought for respect in a world that wanted to deny her very existence. "Dr. Ilara Whitmore," he read aloud, "specializing in surgical procedures and battlefield medicine." The words struck him like a physical blow. She saw him sway slightly, his face draining of color. The license flittered from his nerveless fingers to the floor, Battlefield medicine, he whispered. Yes. I volunteered during the Crimean conflict, served with the medical corps for 18 months. He stared at her with an expression she couldn't interpret. Shock, certainly, but something else, something that looked almost like hope. Where? The word was barely audible, initially at Scutari, then closer to the front lines. Bela Clava, Inkerman. She watched his face carefully. I treated cavalry officers primarily. The 7th Light Dragoons suffered heavy casualties. His legs seemed to give way. He sank into the chair opposite her, his hands gripping the arms until his knuckles showed white. The 7th Light Dragoons, he repeated. Yes. I remember one officer particularly. Young, grievously wounded, very nearly died of his injuries. She leaned forward, her physician's instincts overriding her caution. He had shrapnel wounds to the chest, required extensive surgery. He spoke often in his delirium about duty and honor, about not being worthy of his name. Adrian's breath came in sharp gasps. His hand went to his chest, fingers tracing a pattern she couldn't see beneath his shirt. What did he look like? This officer? Dark hair, grey eyes. Quite tall, well-built. He had a birthmark on his left shoulder, shaped rather like a crescent moon. She paused, her voice softening with memory. I sat with him for 3 days while the fever broke. He held my hand and begged me not to let him die dishonored. Dear God. The words were torn from his throat. He looked up at her with eyes full of wonder and something that might have been terror. You, it was you. Your Grace. He struggled to his feet, began pacing the room like a caged animal. The angel, he muttered. The angel who sang to me in the darkness, who pulled me back from the edge of hell. He whirled to face her. You saved my life. The confirmation hit her like a physical blow. She had suspected, hoped, feared, but now she knew for certain. The Duke of Ravenshollow was the young officer whose life she had preserved, whose hand she had held, whose fevered promises she had witnessed. I remember your voice, he continued, his words tumbling over each other. Soft, gentle, singing old hymns when the pain was too great to bear. I remember your hands, cool against my forehead, steady when you removed the shrapnel from my chest. He stopped before her chair, looking down at her with an expression of absolute awe. I have dreamed of you for 3 years. She found her voice at last. You never saw my face clearly. No. The fever, the laudanum. I caught glimpses, fragments. But your voice, your touch, they are burned into my memory. He knelt suddenly, taking her hands in his. I searched for you. After I recovered, after I returned to England, I made inquiries. No one could tell me who you were, where you had gone. I returned to London after the war ended, resumed my practice, and I have been trying to forget you. His grip on her hands tightened, trying to convince myself you were a fever dream, a phantom born of delirium. Instead, I have been slowly going mad, haunted by the memory of an angel I could never find. She stared at their joined hands, his scarred from battle and work, hers marked by years of healing. Then why did you purchase me? Why this arrangement? His face darkened, the wonder fading from his eyes. Because I am not the man you saved. Dr. Whitmore. That man died on the battlefield, even though his body survived. He released her hands and stood, turning back to the fire. What sits before you is merely a hollow shell, going through the motions of life without truly living. That's not true, isn't it? He laughed bitterly. I returned to find my father dead, his estates encumbered with debt, his name tarnished by scandal. I inherited a title I never wanted, and responsibilities I was unprepared for. I have spent 3 years trying to restore honor to a family name that may be beyond redemption. And you think dishonoring me will somehow accomplish that? He flinched, as if she had struck him. I think I am incapable of honor. The war taught me that idealism is a luxury that few can afford to survive. She rose from her chair and approached him slowly, as she might approach a wounded animal. The man I treated on that battlefield was full of honor. He begged me to tell his family he had tried to be worthy of their name. That man still exists, Adrian. The use of his given name made him turn to look at her. In the firelight, with her auburn hair catching the golden glow and her green eyes soft with compassion, she looked exactly as he had imagined his angel might look. Does he? He asked quietly. I see him now, in your eyes, wounded, certainly, changed by war and loss, but not hollow, not beyond redemption. They stood mere inches apart, the air between them crackling with tension and recognition, and something deeper, the invisible thread that had bound them together from the moment her hands had pulled him back from death. What happens now? He asked. She reached up and traced the scar on his cheek with gentle fingers, her touch as soft as it had been when he was dying in a field hospital half a world away. Now, she said quietly, we discover who we are meant to become. The morning brought clarity and confusion in equal measure. Ilara woke in her opulent bed, having slept better than she had in weeks. Despite, or perhaps because of the revelations of the previous evening, she was not merely the Duke's purchased mistress. She was the physician who had saved his life, the angel who had haunted his dreams. But what did that change, really? The financial arrangement remained the same. Her debts were still cleared, her brother's education still secured. She was still resident in the east wing of Ravenshollow Manor, still bound by the terms of their agreement. Still his, purchased and paid for. The thought left a bitter taste in her mouth as she dressed in her simplest morning gown. Whatever sentiment the Duke might harbor from their battlefield encounter, she could not forget that he had bought her like a commodity. The romance of their reunion could not erase the humiliation of how it had come about. Sarah arrived with breakfast and a message. His Grace requests your presence in the library at your convenience, miss. He says there are matters to discuss. Ilara found him there an hour later, seated at a massive oak table covered with ledgers and correspondence. He wore a simple white shirt and dark trousers, his coat discarded, sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms marked with old scars. He looked younger this way, less ducal, more like the officer she remembered. Dr. Whitmore. He rose as she entered, the formal address a deliberate return to the distance that had existed before last night's revelations. Thank you for coming. She took the chair he indicated, noting that he had positioned it at a respectful distance from his own. You wished to discuss matters, Your Grace? Several matters, yes. He resumed his seat, his hands folded on the table before him. First, I must apologize for the circumstances that brought you here. Had I known who you were, but you didn't know. And now that you do, what changes? The question hung between them like a sword. She watched him struggle with it, his grey eyes reflecting the storm of his thoughts. Everything, he said finally. Nothing. He stopped, ran a hand through his dark hair. I find myself in an impossible situation, Dr. Whitmore. You are here under a contract that was negotiated in good faith, albeit for dishonorable purposes. To release you from it would leave you with no means of supporting yourself or your brother. To hold you to it, knowing what I now know, would make me a villain of the highest order. And you were not already a villain for purchasing a woman's services. His face darkened. I told myself I was being practical, that I was providing for your needs, while securing my own convenience. I convinced myself that many marriages are based on similar transactions, that at least I was being honest about the nature of our arrangement. How noble of you! The sarcasm in her voice made him wince. You have every right to despise me. I don't despise you, Adrian. She used his given name deliberately, wanting to strip away the formal barriers between them. I pity you. Your pity is worse than your hatred. Is it? She leaned forward, studying his face with a physician's eye. Tell me about the nightmares. He started, his carefully controlled expression cracking. What? You have shadows under your eyes that speak of sleepless nights. Your hands tremble slightly, not enough for most to notice, but I am trained to see such things. You drink more than is healthy, and you isolate yourself in this great house like a hermit in a cave. She paused. The war left you with more than physical scars. I am not your patient, Dr. Whitmore. No, she agreed. But I am still a physician, and I can see that you are suffering. He was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the leather-bound books that lined the walls. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. I see their faces. The men who died under my command. I hear their screams, smell the smoke and blood, and he stopped, his jaw clenching. Every night I relive that charge. Every night I watch good men die because I was too green, too idealistic to see the trap we were riding into. How many? She asked gently. Of my squadron, 37 men rode out that morning. 14 came back, his hands clenched into fists. 23 souls on my conscience, Dr. Whitmore. 23 families who received letters telling them their sons, husbands, fathers would not be coming home. And you blame yourself for their deaths. I was their officer, their leader. The responsibility was mine. The responsibility for the charge, perhaps, but not for the war, not for the politicians who sent you into battle, not for the generals who gave impossible orders. She studied his profile, noting the tension in his jaw, the way he held himself rigid with guilt. Tell me, in those final moments before you lost consciousness, what did you think about? He hesitated, then met her eyes. I thought I was dying without having accomplished anything meaningful, that my life had been wasted on useless gestures and empty honors. And what do you think now, knowing that your life was saved? That perhaps it would have been better if you had let me die. The words hit her like a physical blow. She stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. How dare you? He looked up at her, startled by the fury in her voice. How dare you diminish the value of what was preserved that day, she continued, her voice shaking with emotion. I worked for 18 hours to save your life. I used every skill I possessed, every technique I had learned, because I believed I knew that you were worth saving. You didn't know me. I knew enough. She began to pace, her hands gesturing as she spoke. I knew you cared more about your men than yourself. I knew you felt responsible for their welfare even as you lay dying. I knew you would rather perish than live with dishonor. She stopped, turning to face him. That is the man I saved, Adrian. That is the man whose life I fought for. And if you think his existence is worthless, then you insult not only yourself, but every moment I spent trying to preserve it. He stared at her, his face pale, his breathing uneven. I never thought. No, you haven't thought. You've wallowed in guilt and self-pity, hidden away in this house, feeling sorry for yourself while the world continues to turn. She softened her tone slightly. I understand survivor's guilt, Adrian. I've treated dozens of soldiers who carried similar burdens. But guilt unexamined becomes self-indulgence, and self-indulgence helps no one. Then what would you have me do? Live, she said simply. Live worthy of the life that was preserved. Honor your fallen men by being the leader they believed you could be, not by drowning in brandy and regret. He was quiet for several minutes, processing her words. Finally, he looked up at her with something approaching hope in his eyes. "How?" he asked. "How does one learn to live again?" She resumed her seat, leaning forward with the intensity of a physician discussing treatment with a patient. By taking small steps, by finding purpose beyond guilt, by accepting help when it is offered. And you're offering help? I'm offering a partnership. The words surprised her as much as they did him. Not the arrangement you originally proposed, but something different. You need healing, Adrian. I am a healer. Perhaps we can help each other. What sort of partnership? She took a deep breath, hardly believing what she was about to propose. Allow me to practice medicine again. There must be tenants on your estates who need medical care, people in the surrounding villages who cannot afford a physician. Let me be useful. Let me do what I was trained to do. She paused. In return, I will help you find your way back to the man you were meant to be. And the other terms of our arrangement? Heat rose in her cheeks, but she met his gaze steadily. That depends entirely on you, Your Grace. I will not share your bed out of financial obligation, but she hesitated, then forced herself to continue. If genuine affection were to develop between us, if we were to find that we suit each other in more than just a professional capacity, then perhaps we might discover that what began as a transaction could become something more meaningful. He studied her face for a long moment, searching for something she couldn't name. Whatever he found seemed to satisfy him, because a slow smile spread across his features, the first genuine smile she had seen from him. "Dr. Whitmore," he said formally, "I believe we have the foundation for a new agreement." "Indeed we do, Your Grace." And as they shook hands across the table, both of them felt the first stirrings of something that might in time grow into love. 3 weeks into their new arrangement, Alara had transformed not only her own existence, but had begun the delicate work of healing the Duke's fractured soul. She had established a small surgery in what had once been the conservatory, its glass walls providing excellent light for examinations and procedures. Word had spread quickly through the estate and surrounding villages that a qualified physician was in residence at Ravenshollow Manor, and patients began arriving daily. She treated everything from childhood ailments to agricultural injuries, difficult births to consumption cases. The work was gratifying in a way she had almost forgotten. The immediate satisfaction of relieving pain, the quiet triumph of a successful diagnosis, the simple gratitude of people who had previously gone without proper medical care. Adrian, meanwhile, had begun to emerge from his self-imposed isolation. He accompanied her on house calls to his tenants, observing how she interacted with his people, noting their conditions and concerns. She watched him rediscover his natural authority, saw him begin to take an active interest in the welfare of those who depended on him. "Mrs. Hartwell's cottage needs a new roof before winter," she told him one afternoon as they rode back from the village. "And the Cunningham children all show signs of malnutrition. Their father was injured in the harvest and hasn't been able to work." "I had no idea the situation was so dire," Adrian replied, his face grim. "My estate manager assured me all was well." "Your estate manager, I suspect, tells you what he thinks you want to hear." She guided her horse around a muddy patch in the road. "The people are afraid to complain directly to you. They remember the old Duke as a harsh man, and they don't yet trust that you are different." "Am I different?" She considered the question seriously. "You're becoming different. The man who rode out this morning to check on a sick child because his physician recommended it, that man cares about more than his own guilt and grief." They rode in comfortable silence for a while, the autumn landscape spreading around them in shades of gold and crimson. Ilara found herself stealing glances at her companion, noting how he sat his horse with natural grace, how the fresh air had brought color back to his face. He was a handsome man when not haunted by shadows, and she was beginning to realize that her feelings toward him were evolving beyond professional concern. "There's something I need to tell you," he said suddenly. "Oh, I've been making inquiries about your debts, your brother's situation." He kept his eyes fixed on the road ahead. "The debts were not as substantial as you believed. Your father's creditors inflated the amounts, hoping to pressure you into paying more than was actually owed." Ilara reined in her horse, staring at him in shock. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying you could have negotiated a settlement for perhaps a tenth of what you agreed to pay. Your brother's education could have been secured with a modest loan from any number of sources." He finally met her eyes, his expression apologetic. "You were taken advantage of, Ilara, badly." The news hit her like a physical blow. She had sacrificed her freedom, her dignity, her very identity for debts that could have been resolved through conventional means. The humiliation was crushing. "So I sold myself for nothing," she said quietly. "Not for nothing." His voice was gentle but firm. "Your courage, your willingness to sacrifice everything for those you love, that has value that cannot be measured in pounds and pence. Pretty words, but they don't change the fact that I was a fool. You were desperate and uninformed. There's a difference." He dismounted and came to help her down from her horse, his hands lingering at her waist. "The question now is what we do with this knowledge." She looked up at him, acutely aware of his nearness, of the way the afternoon light caught the silver threads in his dark hair. "What do you mean?" "I mean that you are free to leave if you choose. I've arranged for your debts to be properly settled, your brother's education to be funded through conventional means. You could return to London, resume your practice there." The offer was everything she had dreamed of when she first arrived at Ravenshollow: freedom, independence, the chance to reclaim her life. So why did the thought of leaving make her chest tighten with something that felt remarkably like panic? "And if I stayed, then we continue as we have been. You practice medicine. I learn to be a better man and landlord. He hesitated, his hands still resting at her waist. "We see where this leads." "This?" Instead of answering with words, he leaned down and kissed her. It was gentle, questioning, nothing like the demanding passion she might have expected. His lips were warm and soft, tasting of mint and possibility, and when she didn't pull away, his arms tightened around her. When they broke apart, both were breathing unsteadily. "This," he said quietly. "Whatever this is becoming between us." She stared up at him, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Adrian, I know it's complicated. I know the circumstances of our meeting make everything suspect, but I cannot deny that my feelings for you go far beyond gratitude or even desire." His thumb traced her cheek. "I am falling in love with you, Ilara. Have been since that first night when you challenged me to live worthy of the life you saved. You don't have to say such things. The arrangement, damn the arrangement." His voice was fierce. "I am not speaking as the Duke of Ravenshollow, making pretty speeches to his purchased mistress. I am speaking as a man who has found something precious and unexpected, something worth fighting for." She searched his face, looking for signs of deception or manipulation, but found only sincerity and a vulnerability that took her breath away. "I don't know how to trust this," she admitted. "How to trust you or myself, or what I'm feeling." "Then don't trust, not yet." He stepped back, giving her space to breathe. "Stay because you want to help people. Stay because you enjoy the work. Stay because you're curious to see what might grow between us if given the chance." He smiled, that genuine smile that transformed his entire face. But stay because you choose to, not because you feel obligated. She was quiet for a long moment, considering. When she spoke, her voice was steady with decision. I'll stay. Truly, truly. She mounted her horse with his assistance, settling herself in the saddle. But I have conditions. Name them. I want a proper medical facility, not just a converted conservatory. I want authority to treat any patient who needs care, regardless of their ability to pay. And I want your word that you will continue the work we've begun, that you won't retreat back into isolation and self-pity. Agreed. He swung up onto his own horse. Anything else? She looked at him seriously. Time. Adrian. Whatever this is between us, whatever it might become, it needs time to develop naturally. I won't be rushed into anything out of gratitude or sentiment. You shall have all the time you need. He smiled again. After all, I've waited 3 years to find you again. I can wait a little longer to win your heart properly. As they rode back toward Ravenshollow Manor, Alara found herself thinking that perhaps her sacrifice had not been in vain after all. She had come to this place expecting to lose herself, but instead she was discovering who she was truly meant to be. Not just a physician, not just a woman trying to survive in a hostile world, but a partner to a good man who needed healing as much as she needed purpose. And if love grew from such foundations, perhaps it would be strong enough to weather whatever storms lay ahead. Winter came early to Ravenshollow Manor, blanketing the estate in pristine snow that muffled sound and transformed the landscape into something from a fairy tale. But inside the house, warmth bloomed in unexpected places as two wounded souls continued their careful dance toward love. Lara's medical practice had flourished beyond her wildest expectations. The new surgery that Adrian had built for her was a marvel of modern design, well lit, properly ventilated, equipped with the latest surgical instruments and medicines. Patients came not only from the estate and surrounding villages, but from as far as London, drawn by her growing reputation as one of England's most skilled female physicians. More importantly, her work was healing more than just bodies. She had given purpose to a man who had lost his way, and in return he had given her the freedom to be everything she was meant to be. Dr. Whitmore. Sarah's voice interrupted her thoughts as she cleaned surgical instruments after a particularly complex procedure. His Grace is asking for you in the study. Alara found Adrian seated before the fire, staring into the flames with an expression she had learned to recognize. He was wrestling with some internal demon, some memory or regret that had surfaced unbidden. You sent for me? He looked up, and she saw that his eyes were shadowed with old pain. I received a letter today from Colonel Matthews. He served with me in the Crimea. She took the chair opposite him, noting the unopened brandy decanter on the side table. 6 months ago, he would have been halfway through the bottle by now. Progress, she thought. What did he say? He's organizing a memorial for the men who died at Balaclava. He wants me to speak, to represent the officers who survived. Adrian's hands clenched into fists. I can't do it, Alara. I can't stand before their families and pretend to honor their memory when I know I'm responsible for their deaths. You're not responsible, aren't I? I was their commanding officer. I led them into that charge. You followed orders, just as they did. She leaned forward, her voice gentle but firm. Adrian, we've discussed this. You cannot carry the weight of decisions made by politicians and generals, but I can carry the weight of my own choices. He met her eyes, and she saw the torment there. Do you know what my last order was? Before the charge, I told my men to stay close, to follow my lead, that we would show the Russians what English cavalry could do. His voice broke. I filled their heads with romantic notions of glory and honor, and then I led them to slaughter." Lara rose from her chair and went to kneel beside his, taking his hands in hers. "You were 25 years old, Adrian, a young officer doing what you thought was right, following the traditions and training of your class and profession. You could not have known what would happen. But I should have known. The signs were there. The Russian positions, the terrain, the impossibility of the objective. A better officer would have seen the trap. A more experienced officer might have seen it," she corrected. "But experience comes at a cost, and the cost is often exactly what you're carrying, the memory of mistakes made and lessons learned too late." She studied his face, noting the lines of grief and guilt etched around his eyes. An idea began to form, something that might finally free him from the prison of his own regret. "Tell me about them," she said suddenly. "What? Your men, the ones who died. Tell me about them as individuals, not as casualties." He stared at her as if she had lost her mind. "Lara, please, trust me." He was quiet for a long moment, then began to speak, his voice barely above a whisper. Lieutenant Harrison was 22. Fresh out of university, he carried a miniature of his sweetheart in his breast pocket and talked about marrying her when he returned home. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Sergeant Mackenzie had served in India, had a wife and 3 children in Yorkshire. He was the steadiest man I ever knew, could calm a spooked horse with a touch. As he continued, naming each man, sharing their stories and dreams, Ilara watched something extraordinary happen. The weight of guilt began to lift from his shoulders, replaced by something deeper and more healing, love for the men he had led, pride in their courage, gratitude for the privilege of having known them. "They weren't just casualties," she said when he finished. "They were men you cared about, men who trusted you, men who followed you not because they had to, but because they believed in you. And I failed them. You led them with honor and courage. That some of them died doesn't diminish that. It makes it more precious." She squeezed his hands. "Adrian, those men didn't follow you because they thought you were perfect. They followed you because they thought you were worth following. Don't dishonor their faith in you by wallowing in guilt." He stared at her for a long moment, and she saw something shift in his expression, a loosening of the tight control he kept over his emotions, a crack in the wall he had built around his heart. "How do you do it?" he asked softly. "Do what?" "Make me believe that I might be worthy of redemption, because you are worthy. You always have been." She rose and moved to sit on the arm of his chair, her hand smoothing through his dark hair. "The man I saved on that battlefield, the man who has built me a surgery and helped me heal hundreds of people, the man who kisses me like I'm something precious, that man deserves forgiveness, especially from himself." He turned to look up at her, his grey eyes bright with unshed tears. "I love you, Ilara, more than I thought possible, more than I deserve. You deserve everything good this world has to offer," she whispered, leaning down to kiss him softly. "And I love you too, Adrian. Not the title, not the wealth, not even the gratitude I feel for your support of my work. I love the man you are, the man you're becoming." When their lips met this time, it was different from their previous kisses. This was deeper, more urgent, flavored with the salt of tears and the sweetness of mutual surrender. His arms came around her, pulling her down into his lap, and she went willingly, her hands framing his face as they kissed with the desperation of 2 people who had found something precious and were afraid it might be taken away. "Marry me," he said suddenly, the words torn from his throat. She pulled back to stare at him, her heart hammering. "Adrian, I know the circumstances of our meeting were less than romantic. I know you have every reason to distrust my motives, but I swear to you on the memory of every man I lost, on the honor of the name I bear, I am asking you to be my wife, because I cannot imagine living without you. The scandal, let them talk. I've spent too much of my life worrying about the opinions of people who don't matter. His hands cupped her face. I want to wake up beside you every morning for the rest of my life. I want to support your work, celebrate your successes, comfort you through your failures. I want to build a life with you based on love and respect and partnership. She searched his eyes, looking for any trace of duty or obligation, but found only love and hope and desperate sincerity. Yes, she whispered. Yes, yes, I'll marry you. She laughed, the sound bright with joy. But I have conditions. Name them. I keep my medical practice. I continue to be Dr. Whitmore as well as the Duchess of Ravenshollow. Agreed. And you speak at that memorial, not because you're responsible for those men's deaths, but because you remember their lives. He was quiet for a moment, then nodded slowly. If you'll come with me, I wouldn't miss it. As he kissed her again, Alara marveled at the strange paths that life could take. She had come to Ravenshollow Manor as a desperate woman, selling herself to pay her father's debts. She would leave it as a beloved wife and respected physician, partner to a man who had learned to live worthy of the life she had saved. And if that wasn't a miracle worth celebrating, she didn't know what was. 1 year later, the morning sun streamed through the tall windows of the surgery, illuminating the face of Dr. Alara Blackthorne as she carefully stitched a gash on young Tommy Hartwell's arm. The boy had taken a tumble from his father's cart, but the wound was clean and would heal well with proper care. There now, she said, tying off the last suture. Keep it clean and dry, and come see me in a week to have the stitches removed. Yes, Mum, Tommy said, staring at her with the awe reserved for miraculous healers. Thank you, Your Grace. She smiled at the title, still strange on the tongues of her patients. 6 months married, and she was still adjusting to being both doctor and duchess, but the people of Ravenshollow had embraced her completely. They were proud to have a physician of her skill in residence, and prouder still that their duke had chosen love over convention. As Tommy left with his mother, Alara heard familiar footsteps in the corridor. She turned to find Adrian approaching, looking magnificent in his riding clothes, his face bright with the vitality that had returned to him over the past year. How many patients today? He asked, kissing her cheek in greeting. 7, including a birth. Mrs. Patterson's daughter delivered a healthy son this morning. Excellent news. He studied her face with the careful attention of a husband who had learned to read his wife's moods. You look tired. A little. It was a long night. She began cleaning her instruments, a routine so familiar it was almost meditative. How was your meeting with the tenant farmers? Productive. The new drainage system is working better than expected, and the harvest should be excellent this year. He watched her work, noting the slight pallor of her complexion, the careful way she moved. Alara, when did you last eat? I had breakfast. When? She paused, trying to remember. Yesterday morning, I think. Yesterday? He moved to her side, his hand going to her forehead to check for fever. Darling, you can't keep neglecting yourself like this. Your patients need you healthy. I'm fine, truly. Just a little tired. She swayed slightly as she spoke, and his arms came around her immediately, steadying her. When did you last have your monthly courses? He asked quietly. The question caught her off guard. She tried to think, to calculate, but the dates seemed to blur together. It's been... How long, Alara? Perhaps 6 weeks? 7? She looked up at him, seeing her own dawning realization reflected in his eyes. Oh, indeed. His smile was radiant as he swept her up in his arms, spinning her around the surgery. Dr. Blackthorne, I believe you need to examine yourself. "Put me down, you madman," she laughed, but her hands went instinctively to her still flat stomach. "I can't be certain without proper examination." "Then examine yourself. I'll wait." An hour later, she emerged from the small examination room adjacent to the surgery, her face glowing with wonder and just a touch of apprehension. "Well?" Adrian asked, though her expression had already given him his answer. "It appears I'm going to need to train an assistant," she said softly. "I'll be somewhat occupied come spring." He crossed the room in 3 strides, gathering her into his arms and kissing her with a passion that made her dizzy. When they broke apart, both were laughing and crying at the same time. "A baby," he whispered against her forehead. "Our baby. Are you pleased?" "Pleased? Alara, I'm ecstatic." "Terrified, but ecstatic." He pulled back to look at her seriously. "But you must promise me you'll be more careful with yourself. No more skipping meals, no more working yourself to exhaustion." "I promise, though I intend to continue practicing as long as possible." "I wouldn't expect anything less from the woman who performed surgery while 8 months pregnant with the future heir to Raven's Hollow." He grinned at her shocked expression. "What? If our child is anything like its mother, it will probably be born holding a scalpel." As they walked back to the main house together, Alara marveled at the turns her life had taken. She had come to Raven's Hollow as a desperate woman with nothing left to lose. Now she was a duchess, a respected physician, a beloved wife, and soon to be a mother. More than that, she was truly herself for the first time in her life, not hiding her intelligence, not apologizing for her skills, not compromising her dreams for anyone else's comfort. "Regrets?" Adrian asked, as if reading her thoughts. "None," she said firmly. "Not a single one. Not even the circumstances that brought us together." She considered this seriously. "I think perhaps everything happened exactly as it was meant to. The debts, the arrangement, even your isolation and pain, all of it led us to each other, led us to this moment. You don't think we would have found each other anyway? Perhaps. But would we have been ready for each other? Would you have been prepared to love a woman who challenged you, who refused to be decorative? Would I have been willing to trust a man with your power and position?" She shook her head. "I think we both needed to be broken a little, to be humbled, before we could recognize what we found in each other." He lifted their joined hands to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her wedding ring. "Then I am grateful for every moment of pain that led me to you." As they entered the house where they had first met as buyer and purchased woman, where they had discovered their shared past and forged their hopeful future, Alara reflected on the strange alchemy of love. It could transform the most impossible circumstances into something beautiful, turn desperation into destiny, and make even the darkest beginnings shine with the promise of happily ever after. Behind them, in the surgery where she had healed so many others, sunlight fell across the examination table where she had just confirmed the greatest healing of all, the creation of new life from the union of 2 hearts that had found their way home to each other at last. And in the distance, church bells began to ring, calling the faithful to evening prayer, their bronze voices carrying across the estate like a blessing on all who dwelt within the walls of Raven's Hollow Manor, where love had conquered all and promised to endure forever.